Well, the icebreaker activity we were going to do, and we still probably should do a version of it, was about orienting yourself to data. So do you want to maybe talk through it a little bit? And
So I thought we'd just get our minds, icebreaker, please. Today we're gonna, I guess I should say, talk about data for multiple purposes and how to use it for multiple purposes. We often get a sheet, right, of results or data from the state or from CWRA, and we have multiple ways that we can use that data. And I think oftentimes it just kind of ends up in a inbox on somebody's desk, or I'll look at it later. And so today we're going to walk you through some ways that we at NTAC Network use data, and Chris's experience with all the CWRA schools and how they use data. So we're going to talk about using...
Can I stop you?
Yeah.
Because I don't know what that CW is.
Sorry.
I'll explain it, but I'm going to talk some about the CWA and its data today, but really as a proxy for the way you would use any data. But just to explain it, about 10% of the schools within the network use the CWRA so that the network itself can make sure that it's delivering on its promise to basically graduate students with a certain skill set, 21st century, deeper learning, whatever you want to call it. And you have copies of the Student Learning Outcomes Report. So Emil's done a couple of presentations about this annual report that NTAC has put out for the second year now, right? And one of the metrics they use is the CWRA.
So C.
The College Work Readiness Assessment.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Thank you. You're welcome. Sorry for interrupting.
Yeah, no problem. No problem. It's your school uses it, and I think Memphis uses it as well. Just really measure of critical thinking skills. So you have some time to talk about it a little bit later.
Yeah.
Right? Okay. So we're going to talk about how data is often used to communicate results. So I put some fun graphs in here before we get to the assessment graph, but how you communicate results or the outcomes of something. We're also going to talk about how data can be used to help make strategic decisions. This one being I think the decision about studying in school compared to girlfriend time and proposals, but just a good depiction of data, right? Or also how to improve daily practice. Okay, so differentiating strategic decision making from the daily practice in schools. We use graphs, so we're going to use some graphs today, but not a ton. But I wanted to just get your mind thinking about data and thinking about graphs. And we use graphs for a number of different reasons. One would be comparing. So we use pie charts often to compare parts of a whole, right? And then we use bar charts often to compare two, right, or more groups. So we use a lot of these bar charts in our work with the network data because we're often comparing new tech to non-tech. To identify trends over time, right? So how things progress from one year to the next or 1 month to the next. Use line graphs, and then, more recently everybody's using infographics, right? So I said for people who don't really read graphs, we use infographics, but those are the primary purposes of graphs and ways to visualize data. And so what we want you to do now to get your mind thinking about data in kind of a fun way is to draw a graph about your professional or personal life in the last 3 months or so. And be sure it either communicates some sort of results, right? Was how you influenced a strategic decision in your life, or you improved daily practice in your life. And then be prepared to share with the group. I have pencils and pens. Want to share?
Yeah, you looked at me, so I'll go. I'm currently working on a book, so I've been reading a lot of other books to get in, so it's my reading and knowledge. And so this in the past 3 months, basically it's saying, I'm just kind of guessing here, but 30 minutes is like a little bit of knowledge. This is like every day, and so about 60 minutes, a little bit more knowledge, and then even more at 90, a lot more and a ton more would kind of be how the day is. I've been trying to get about 3 hours of reading in each day. It's really, but yeah, it's actually really a lot harder. So that's kind of what I've been doing the past few months.
Great. I'm curious what the book is about.
I'm trying to mix. I'm into politics and science fiction, so I'm kind of mixing them together, and it's about something with space. So we're working on that, but I'm trying to get ideas. We really like Ray Bradbury. If you know who that guy is. I really like the way he writes, really descriptive. So we're trying to get some ideas from it. So,
Okay. Since we're so small, everybody gets to share.
Great.
Brand new data person.
So I have a chart comparing the number of consultant buzzwords and the number of education buzzwords. You can see 2012 through 2014, the number of consultant buzzwords increased, and then also the number of education buzzwords decreased. And then all of a sudden, between 2014 and 2015, expected consultant buzzwords dropped precipitously. I expect the education buzzwords to continue to increase.
Very nice.
We did not collaborate, but I told you I just started a couple months ago out of the business world. So I graphed the number of education acronyms learned. Good Lord, you all have more acronyms
Yes.
than NASA. So it goes 0 up. Eventually, I think we'll hit 1,000s.
I took a more humorous side of mine. So my graph is stress as I approach summer break. So my job, basically, I say I juggle sand, and each grain of sand is a task or responsibility. So, but I just put months ago, I got 3, 2, 1, and then I got 0 of number of tasks to infinity. And so I can't start at 0 because I've always had some. So basically, it's a simple graph that just kind of shows that as I get closer to the end, because I have 30-something districts that I have to report to and talk about, and I got kids summer school, so it really actually kind of starts to increase a lot more. So when summer break hits next Thursday, I'll be pretty good. Oh, and we're changing to a new student management system, so I'm working in that process. So I have a software background, so I'm at least okay with that.
Very good. One of my favorites in our own staff was, I think, alcohol consumption compared to like learning how to do the CRAs, right? The college readiness assessments. So, so yeah.
Just don't get confused with CWR.
Right, which you don't confuse. The research team at New Tech Network has been delving into the world of improvement science which is really from the healthcare industry, and so we've been fascinated for the last 2 weeks, Emil and I, about run charts, which is just measuring like things over time. And so I was so fascinated with this, and I'm struggling with getting my 7-year-old out the door in the morning, and he is a mathematically inclined kid, so we now have a run chart on our refrigerator that looks kind of like this, about how many minutes it takes him to actually brush his teeth and get dressed in the morning. And the first morning we did it, I don't know if this is exactly right, but it was low. And I was like, oh, maybe it's not as bad as I thought. But we've been stuck up here in the 20 minutes to brush his teeth and get dressed for a while. So I'm actually hoping that visualizing it is going to help him.
What are you trying to?
I would like him to get down to 10 minutes. Yeah.
This is a teacher frustration chart. We've got 3 different pie charts, specifically with acquiring data that they need to do their job for. And I went on the negative route, looking at the level of frustration. So we started 3 school years ago with 75% of our teachers being frustrated when the principal asked, I need some data. And the other 25% didn't care. They're neutral. To now today, teachers feel very confident that they can get the data they need. 75% of them feel they can get the data. We still have some neutral people that don't feel like it's important to their job, and we still have some people frustrated. Just they're not mathematically inclined, so they look at a charter graph and don't know what it means. So,
Great. And the only one at the table to use something other than a line graph.
Yeah, exactly.
divergent.
So I chose something personal, and I've been very fortunate in the last 3 years to spend part of my summer in Hawaii, specifically the island of Kauai. And if any of you have been there, you know it is a place with a lot of insects, and I'm a magnet for mosquitoes, spiders, centipedes, you name them. So I get bitten a lot, and my chart is around my attempt to reduce the number of bites I get. So 2 years ago, I literally had 20 insect bites over the course of a week, and the dark line represents my hope for what would happen over the course of the 3 years. And each year I've added on additional strategies to avoid getting bitten, and the more I do, the worse it gets. So I went last month and got bitten 60 times despite a lot of insect repellent and bug spray and all that stuff.
So when we talk a lot about authentic assessment, we talk really, at least where I come from, borrow a lot from Grant Wiggins and the idea behind backward design. So starting first with thinking through what your desired results are, thinking about what are the pieces of evidence that would help you determine whether you've effectively met those results, and think then about the experiences and instruction that will get you to both the evidence and the desired results themselves. So if we want to put this in the spectrum of the work that's going on in the network and in schools, when we think about the desired results, we know from the mission statement of the network itself that we want to enable students to gain the knowledge and skills they need to succeed in life, college, and the careers of tomorrow. What's the acceptable evidence to decide whether we've done that? This is another good point where we'd want to look at the Student Learning Outcomes Report. So here, specifically, the types of metrics or data we're collecting: graduation rates, college readiness, college acceptance and persistence, and student growth. And what are the experiences and instruction that lead to those things? Again, for the network, we're talking about project-based learning, a culture that empowers students and teachers, and integrated technology in the classroom. Those are the core sort of foundational elements of new tech schools. So then the next question is, if we want to specifically look at something like student growth, and that's what we're focusing on with the CWRA, as a way to measure whether these instructional approaches are effective, how do we authentically do that? So I think then we need to, once again, think about what are the definitions of these actual terms. So in the Echo folder for this session, I'm really borrowing from three core folks right now. So everything I'm about to put on the screen, certainly no need to copy it because there's a handout where all of this is collected. But for Wiggins, his definition of authentic is a representative challenge within a given discipline. This involves ambiguous, ill-structured tasks or problems, and students are problem finders as much as they're problem solvers. When he talks about real world, talks about how students can get their hands dirty. They build, they create. The focus is on the impact of one's work in real or realistic contexts. This is a really important point. Real world tasks are not always authentic. So let's say that you teach a biology course and you decide it's really going to be a great activity if we go work at a food kitchen. That's a real world task, but it's not authentically aligned with teaching biology. So there has to be orientation to what you're actually trying to teach when you try to develop these real world tasks. In terms of how this translates into performance tasks, this is the application of authentic and real world tasks for assessment purposes. Students are actually performing. The challenge is in making it real world for everyone. And that's why often the focus is on transfer. What we mean by that is the assessment of the types of skills that are applicable across content area. It's hard to say if I created a task that was steeped in biology, that would be real world for Patrick because he has no interest in that. So if we're looking at things like critical thinking or problem solving or effective communication, the types of things that implicitly I think we all agree students need to have as skills when they graduate, we can take examples that are steeped in these specific areas, but the focus on the assessment itself is on these other tasks. So let's go back to Mark Chun and dive deeper into the characteristics of what a performance task is. So performance tasks contain a real-world scenario. The more students can imagine themselves in the scenario, the more likely they are to be engaged. They are asked to apply course knowledge and skills, or they may need to apply their knowledge in a way that represents a significant transfer of knowledge and skills. This is an authentic and complex process. There may not be a right or wrong answer. Solutions aren't always obvious or given, and information can be conflicting or partial. They're focusing on higher order thinking. The task requires students to engage in critical thinking, analytic reasoning, and problem solving. Students arrive at a judgment or decision, but that doesn't mean that all problems are solved. In fact, the solutions that students come up with often cause their own additional problems. So I went to a school that was thinking about, if they were going to build a soccer field, where on their campus might they build it? And the only space that was big enough to, put the soccer field was where a volleyball court already existed. So they basically had to say what's more important to us, and we have to realize that there's essentially a trade-off. We're going to put the soccer field here, and the problem it's going to cause is that people who like volleyball aren't going to have their court anymore. There's authentic performance, and what we mean by that is that when we think about the actual product that comes out of the assessment itself, is it looks similar to something a student would actually do in the real world. So it might be a memo or a presentation or a write-up. When we do this through the CWA, we have to be frank and note that we're limited by time and resources. So we're often asking students to write a written product that doesn't take any longer than 60 minutes. The great thing about teaching and learning is that those same sort of structures aren't imposed pedagogically. So a lot of the schools that use the CWA or use a performance task approach, the authentic product can take an entire semester to develop. This is, I think, the most important criteria, is that the evaluation aspect itself is transparent, that the learning outcomes drive the creation of the task, and that the evaluation criteria are clear to the students in advance, that they know what they're going to be assessed upon, so that they can strive for those things. Let's see if this works. Oh, it worked. Okay, so we haven't actually introduced the session because we've been talking mostly about the things you need to do in order to make sure that the data you collect is authentic to what you're trying to measure. So all we've been talking about so far is pedagogy and authenticity. So this is my chance to introduce the actual session. I didn't even think about agents of change, but I could, say that I did this because of agents of change, but mostly because, when I'm putting together presentations, I sort of obsess over making it somewhat creative. And I was thinking, what movies out there don't actually start their credits until like 20 or 30 minutes into the movie itself, and that's true of many James Bond movies. So welcome to Data, Data Everywhere, starring me, Chris Jackson. I'm the director of the CWA, and Sherrie and Patrick are here as well.
Great.
Yes.
Love it.
Okay. One more thing before we get into the data that I think is important to talk about. So we talked about authentic assessment, but we also need to talk about assessing authentically. Patrick's going to dive deeply into this, and what I mean by that is you can say, we found this great assessment that's authentically aligned with our teaching goals, and we're going to make all of our teachers implement it. And that's not assessing authentically, because your data could be biased by your faculty's feelings that this has been imposed upon them. We've had some cases with the CWA that teachers say to students, this is an extra thing, don't spend too much time on it, and that biases the data. So when we think about assessing authentically, we're talking more about the practices one can put into place to make sure that if you've chosen an assessment that is authentically aligned with your teaching and learning goals, your data can be as real and as clean as possible. So Patrick's actually done a lot of work with new tech schools and actually some of the schools that are part of the CWA network to find out what practices they've put into place to assess authentically.
So we just wanted to take about 10 minutes or so to share some of the findings from our research study, because I think it'll provide some good context for our conversations as we dive into some of the data. And as Sherrie mentioned, we basically had a case study research approach where we were interested in a few specific things. We wanted to see what the relationship is between the College and Work Readiness Assessment, the CRAs and standardized state test scores, which Sherrie just said, and we wanted to see what does the implementation look like? How do schools roll out these assessments? And ultimately, how do they use the results from these assessments for different purposes, for school improvement, for instructional purposes, for conferencing with students? So we followed two new tech schools during all of last year to try and see what the rollout looked like. And I went to professional development sessions, I interviewed teachers and directors. What we learned was that Many of our schools in the network are in early stages of implementing and using this college and work readiness assessment. So we also looked outside of the network at schools and districts that have several years of experience of using the CWRA to get a sense of what some of their best practices were. So our findings kind of emerged across these 7 areas in terms of buy-in among staff and students, ways in which schools are communicating results to different stakeholders, in particular students and parents, and then specific uses around the data for instructional purposes. So we all know our students take a large number of assessments during the year, which means our teachers have a large number of assessments to administer. And one of the clear things I think emerged from our study was that all the leaders said it was of such critical importance to overly communicate the purpose and the goals for the assessments that they're giving. So with our network CRAs, there was actually some confusion among faculty as to why are we giving this? What is the purpose of it? It was floating around in some schools, maybe this is just another writing assessment as opposed to an assessment that's intended to measure critical thinking. So ensuring that the clarity of the goal and the purpose and how the data is going to be used. So is this a formative assessment? Is it summative? How do we intend to use the results once we get them? With our schools that did the CRAs, there was a pattern around accountability, but also a great deal of support and flexibility. So our 2 focus schools basically said, we want our teachers to commit to doing 2 CRAs during the year, one in the fall and one in the spring, but they left it up to the facilitators as to when they gave them, how they created them. The main concern was let's not schedule the CRAs across different courses all at the same time with kids having to do like 4 CRAs in a course of a week. So giving teachers that flexibility to sort of determine, at least in the first year, what made the most sense in terms of the timeline and the actual creation of the tasks. We were going to actually give you a mock CWRA to take at the beginning of the session, and there just wasn't enough time to do it. But all of the leaders that we spoke with who did the CWRA, said that the way to get faculty bought in and to understand the actual assessment was that they had to take it themselves to understand what the perspective was that students experience. So a lot of the schools we spoke with said, first thing we do at the beginning of the year is in a faculty meeting, we give the assessment to teachers to actually take. They actually take the source documents from the CWRA and they go through the initial steps of responding to it so that they have a better sense of what do our kids actually face when they're taking the assessment. So many data points that you get back from different assessments, and a lot of the leaders that we spoke with said they selected 1 or 2 key data points to hone in on so that the faculty had a shared understanding of what the results meant, and those were the target points. So principal said to me, students can smell a low stakes assessment a mile away and they will act accordingly, right? So how do you get students to buy into these assessments when they realize that they are low stakes? So our schools talked about understanding the conditions for optimal student performance. And when it came to the CWRA, that meant for a lot of schools administering assessments in the morning, giving them ample time to complete it, ensuring that they talked with students and got feedback as to what would be sort of the right conditions to help them perform well on the assessment. Some of the schools sort of went above and beyond to prepare students. They did pep talks with students before the assessment. Some schools made breakfast for the kids in the morning before they went into the testing session. Intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation. So how are we going to motivate kids to take the assessment and take it seriously? And our schools talked about different ways in which they've done that. Some have thought about or are planning on using badging. Some give specific feedback to students. The posting individual results was very interesting because the NTAC schools aren't doing this, but the schools outside of the network said that they were. And what we mean by that is that they are, with certain college-ready assessments, are posting the students' scores on their transcripts. And they said that the moment they did that, it changed how students thought about the assessment because it then became something that was going on their official records that colleges were going to see, and they ended up taking it much more seriously.
So we're going to talk about the way that schools use data in three primary ways, and these ways are not mutually exclusive. All right. So a lot of schools focus on using data in order to communicate goals and results to stakeholders, like for PR reasons or to create a marketing campaign. Some schools do it because they're looking to make very specific decisions about where to improve instruction. What's going on over here?
Sorry.
And then the third way is as an opportunity to improve daily teaching and learning practices. So we're gonna as we move forward, we're gonna really dive into these three topics. And when we dive into them, even within those topics, we're gonna approach these things through three different ways. So we'll share some best practices of schools that have used the CRAs or the CWRAs, the ways that they use data to do these things. We've invited some practitioners in, mostly via Skype, to share their experiences, only via Skype. And then the third way is we'll take you all through an activity where we'll provide you with some data and ask you to do these things. So when we think about how schools use data to create a message, a lot of times they're basically trying to tell a story about their culture, what it means to be X school, or what it means to be a student in X school. So going back to this idea of authenticity, I think we should also define what we mean by culture. So generally speaking, a definition for culture could be the collective programming of the mind which distinguishes one group or category of people from another. Feels really robotic. So let me talk to you about what we think the culture of a CWRA school is. We know this having worked from the schools that tend to use the CWRA, which tend to be more progressive. So a CWRA culture is sort of a school or group of schools that, as part of their core belief, assert that their way of preparing students for the 21st century is different and often better. But they go a step further than that. CWRA member schools naturally understand that an inherent part of illustrating better is not through words alone, but also through action, through using assessments that prove or sometimes disprove these institutional claims. Now, as I was writing this up, it occurred to me that these could also be definitions for NTAC culture. Wouldn't you agree? That the NTAC schools as a group feel like their approach is probably better than the alternative. But NTAC, and I think that this is why our partnership has forged as strongly as it is, also feels that it's not enough to say you can look at PBL and feel like it's probably better, but it's also important to measure whether that's true or not. So there's a tab on the spreadsheet called Key that you should look at later. I don't want you to worry about it right now. But if later on you want to play with this data set and sort of know what you're looking at, you could do that. But for the purposes of solving this problem, really what you're looking at is window, fall. There's a fall window and there's a spring window. And typically, fall is when freshmen are assessed, and the spring is when seniors are assessed, or other students as well. You can also discern this information from the category class. So class is coded by freshman, sophomore, junior, senior. So we started with an assessment in higher education, and then a bunch of high schools said, do you have anything for us? So we created a high school assessment. But in both cases, and because we're measuring these skills through general education, which is independent of your major, you should have these skills. Faculty in both high school and college started coming to us and saying, we get that, but we'd love to be able to develop performance tasks where we can embed our own course content. So we put together a workshop where we basically taught people, here's how you create a performance task. So if you have time and look at the sample I provided you, we basically tell people, here's how you develop compelling scenarios. The CWRA is document-based, so we're asking students to pull information from documents we provide to them. So how do you pull together documents and embed information on them, some of which might be facetious, some of it which might be real, some of it might be false. Basically, how do you test students' critical thinking skills? So Jared and his team basically started going to these workshops and say, well, we want to take your format and apply it to middle school, because you're not doing that. And like I said, we said, okay, who are we to stop you? Plus, we like you a lot. So that's what Jared was referring to. We have professional development work. Yeah. And one of the activities...
What was that time frame like? Did it take a month of teachers' work, 4 weeks of them?
It takes a long time. So the workshop itself is 2 days long, and we work really hard to make sure that people come out of that workshop with a skeletal performance task. So the work that happens after that is they're basically going back and filling in the gaps, putting a little bit more rigorous work into that. And at that point, I would say it probably can take 2 months to a year. But if you have a bunch of teachers in each content area doing this work, they develop 2 to 4 performance tasks a year. And it's not just for assessment purposes, so it doesn't have to be super rigorous in terms of its statistical validity. I mean, a lot of the performance task development that's happening is because teachers want to use it as a curricular tool. Say, well, every week we'll introduce students to a new document, and that document will help us teach students about the limitations of correlation and causation. And next week we'll provide them with a newspaper article because we're going to talk to them about small sample size. So this is not the real data for a school that I've worked with, but this is a real scenario. So my colleague Jess and I went down with a school and did a 2-day data mining workshop with them because they wanted to know what are the areas that we need improvement on. And they asked us in advance to sort of do some analysis for them. And this is essentially the breakdown that they saw. And Jess and I were pretty sure that they were going to say, oh, great, there was an achievement gap, and we solved it. Right? So as freshmen, females are doing significantly better than males. And by the time they exit their senior year, that's gone away. So we were ready that they'd say, okay, great, this is something we're going to herald. Now, this is an independent private school in North Carolina. And their actual takeaway was concern because they have a large percentage of male population teachers. And they said, oh, are our male population teachers somehow biasing in favor of the male students? Which it was an interpretation I could never have expected. But it made it clear to me that what's important here is that people look at data, and even when people think about data, the sort of instinct is that numbers are always going to tell you what the right or the wrong answer is. But here's a school that basically looked at data that Jesselyn and I assumed, why wouldn't they say achievement gap gone, but had a dramatically different interpretation, just as you guys did, because you guys were looking at the traits of the students when they came in the first place. Yeah. What we're finding is that the distribution of the mastery levels is a pretty dramatic normal curve, where mastery is we're talking about 2 standard deviations, and this is all Drew's fault. So I think when we brought the experts in, they really, I think, put a lot of value in this notion of mastery, which is that you basically have to show a lot of skill in order to be considered a master in these skills. And we're seeing the proficient level being like you'd expect a normal curve to be, which is that there's about, at this point, 60% of the students that take the assessment are falling the proficient level, between 5 and 10 at the mastery level, and then pretty big segment still in the below proficient level, even at the senior level. So if there were a larger group in the room, the other things we wanted people to consider, and maybe if you're feeling curious on your plane, you want to run some more data, because that's what we love to do on airplanes. We're looking at improvement by skill set, right? What areas can we say our school excels at? So I'd mentioned those 6 subscores that we're looking at. The data set that you have would enable a school to say, yeah, we might be the greatest school out there, but if we look really closely at our sub-skills, we might actually find out that scientific reasoning is pretty poor. And we're really making sure that schools look at that data, because even in the highest performing schools, there's areas for improvement. You think about a school that falls right in the middle, like they're average, they're the mean school. The instinctual interpretation is, okay, well, we're average. But it could be true that they're an average in every category, or it could be true that there are 3 categories that they excel at, and there are 3 categories that they're abysmal at. And that's why we're really making sure that our schools are looking finally at their data. And then What we also have on the CWRA is an option for schools to include their own survey questions. So if they have, if they speculate that there's something that they do that probably correlates with CWRA data, they can ask those questions of students. So in that data set, there's a dummy question, which I think
So,
is,
how many papers?
how many papers do you write?
That's a good question.
Yeah.
Because
because
the 5 or more to me would be like an AP class or something.
you would expect those students would be performing higher, right?
Yeah.
So this is the actual data that shows, which is that students that write more papers do better, but the actual growth is still about the same. And it's a little bit big. It's a little bit less growth the higher you get on, but students, freshmen who don't write a lot of papers, don't do that great, and seniors that do write a lot of papers don't do that great. So the growth between those two isn't particularly impressive, but it's not surprising for us to find that students that write more do better on this assessment. So what I want you not to do, but one thing I want to provide both of you, this is also an echo, is the activity that we're not going to have time for, but that talks about developing performance tasks, is based upon this model. So when we create performance tasks, and when we teach people to create performance tasks, so when we sit people down and think about creating performance tasks, we really get them thinking about assigning student-specific roles, engaging them in the process. In each performance task that students take, they're assigned a role. They're not some sort of observer at 30,000 feet. They might be a mayor to, they might be a newspaper reporter, or they might be an advisor to a mayor. But they have some sort of stake in the process. In our performance tasks, we require students to come to a decision. And as I mentioned before, that decision needs to be reflected in an authentic product. So they might be writing a memo or creating a presentation. And just to make things interesting, we make sure that we introduce some stake. So the example that I include on this sheet is very simply, you take a noun and an action, in this case sweetgrass, and writing an article. The task that was created here is that a student is a reporter at a local newspaper. Their decision is that they've been asked by an editor to write and to investigate whether there's a story behind some conflicting reports about a new sweetener made out of sweetgrass. The product is they have to write an email to their editor pitching the story. And the stake is there's another newspaper in town that may get the scoop if they don't act quickly enough. This is only the scenario. So when we teach people to create performance tasks, we'll go through a similar process about finding documentation or even creating documentation from scratch that would lend support to both sides in most cases. So we want students to have evidence from both sides and come to a conclusion based upon the evidence that they're drawn. The goal isn't to get students to write, to pick the right answer, but to be able to defend whatever answer they come to. So as a simple exercise, and to show people in many cases how easy it can be to write performance tasks, and take them through this process where we assign them a noun based upon their birth date. So Dean, what month were you born in?
January.
January. So your noun might be panda, all right? And your article, your action is finding a new job. So when we go through this activity, a lot of people think immediately, how am I going to combine panda and finding a new job? When you get 4 or 5 people around the table, the creative juices get flowing, and people come up with these really compelling performance tasks. So it could be that the new job that you're trying to find is, you are a zoologist. You really want to work at a zoo that has a panda. Maybe you introduce elements of the Chinese political system and how they're taking away a panda at the DC Zoo, and that's where your family really wants to live. You want to move to San Diego because there's a panda there. So what we were trying to prove to people through this exercise is that when you take these sort of semi-ridiculous concepts that don't feel like they go together, and when people go through the exercise and see, I can put these together, they realize I'm the owner of my content knowledge. If I can do this with information that I'm uncomfortable with, surely I can do it in my own content area. unfortunately, we can't dive into that task, but you have this as a resource. This is also up on Echo. And then the flip side of this are all the talking points that I mentioned. I didn't get a chance to talk about John Austin. That was in the section where we talked about culture. John was the academic dean at a private school in Delaware called the St. Andrews School. And he really talked about the utility of performance tasks as teaching and assessment devices as an opportunity to change the culture of his school. He wrote this article called Creating an Academy of Learning, where he basically said, when we keep asking students to take assessments whose only goal is to regurgitate core content knowledge, we're not creating deeper thinkers. So he does a really interesting job of talking about at St. Andrews how they went through this evolution where teachers were starting to think about compelling students to think in new ways. And then for them as educators to reward those new ways of thinking. I think the conflict that we're seeing in education right now is that teachers themselves, including me, were raised in an educational paradigm where collection of content was the norm. But now we're in a space where the content is there, it's accessible, you can get it on the internet. So teaching is evolving into using that content responsibly. But the teachers themselves were raised in this world, and students are being raised in this world. So there's something of a conflict there. Teachers like John often find themselves having conversations with older educators who have been teaching in the same way for a long time and are uncomfortable with new ways of teaching and learning. I think these are important conversations for us all to be having.
So we know this was a lot of information today, but we wanted to give you a chance to sort of reflect on how some of the areas that we talked about in terms of data use, how these might play out back at your school site. So we want you to just take a few minutes to kind of reflect on what are some of the kind of big data and assessment issues that you're facing at your school, and whether there are any strategies or practices that we talked about today that you think could apply back at your site. And we are always striving to better understand how the network can support you. So lastly, are there resources or supports that you need to be able to implement these back at your school, specifically how the network might be able to help? Does anything sort of come to mind? Were there things that were useful that we discussed today that you think might hold some implications?
I'm just going to share a thought. Maybe there's no real answer to it, but probably no answer to it. NTAC was born out of the high school, secondary realm. And there's two philosophies in middle school. One philosophy that's been really abandoned, which is your secondary school, but just smaller, with smaller people. We're more in the philosophy that we're elementary, grown-up elementary kids. And so that affects us culturally quite a bit, because when it comes time to hire, I would much prefer to hire an elementary teacher with a certification in math or science, because they understand kids, they understand middle schoolers, as opposed to a secondary teacher who understands content. Just as a broad stroke. The reason why I'm coming there is the short cycle assessments that I talked about are all surface knowledge, because we believe that there are still skills that have to be acquired before you can apply. And I use amongst non-educators, I use the whole idea of playing the piano. Before you can play a piece on the piano that shows thought and expression, you have to know the chords, and you have to know the scales, and you have to practice them. There's even a book out there that says you got to practice them 10,000 hours to be good. So, at what place in our educational system is that basic skill, assessment of the basic skills still important? I think it's admirable, absolutely admirable. But at one point in the workshops today, one person talked about pushing higher order thinking but having skills deficits. So I wonder.
Dean, how about for you?
For me, I think looking at the data differently, because right now we're in a huge push to collect data. We even just sent a survey out to our 3 graduating classes of what they're doing. So but we're definitely in a big push to try to show value in our program. So CWRA is one area that we're going to use for value and other data. So what helps me today is understanding looking at the data as well too, and being able to add some stuff to that, analyzing it a little bit more. But it's been a struggle for us. Like I said, how do you show value without devaluing what others are doing?
We should, I want just to go back to, I know you're trying to close it off, but the short cycles though really intrigues me because of our work in improvement research. So we'll have to talk some more about that. Thank you.
The hard problem, there's quite a few variables that are happening with our improvement. I mean, we've earned a 30 to 40% improvement in our standardized testing over the 3 years I've been working with this school. So unfortunately, there's too many variables. We added new tech during that time.
Yeah.
We changed staff because many of our staff were not happy with short cycle assessments nor new tech. You know, so we changed leadership all within these 3 years. So
Right.
which variable is the biggest impact? Who knows?
Some economist will figure it out 20 years from now.
Yeah.
But,
Yeah, but we'll have a different curricular and assessment approach.
yeah, but they'll look back at the data 20 years old.
You hit the nail on the head about one thing. I always said it's interesting that we have teachers who are teaching, you know, with use of technology. You know, kids are brought up now, you know, to look at the cell phone. Our first graduating class in 2007, when the iPhone was out for what, a year and a half maybe at that point in time. Within 4 years or 5 years of that, almost all phones had some sort of. So it's like a 5-year trend. But yet you got teachers who are teaching at a different generation. Like, and I learned, you know, the difference in generations as well too. So expectations, it's really interesting that, you know, how can you teach students who are living in the world? You know, it's two separate worlds you live in. You know,
Yeah.
I apologize, we have to catch it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you guys for
Thank
joining
you,
us. We
and
really
for bearing
appreciate
with
it.
us for a
Yeah.
Friday afternoon.
my partner in crime is next door, so.
You guys won the Hunger Games.